How's it going, my fellow history scholars? Welcome back to the podcast where we talk about the unanswered questions of history and unravel the mystery of the many questions of our past. I'm your host today, and with me is James Romm, who is an author, reviewer, and professor of classics at Bard College in Annandale, New York. James, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
James has recently published a new book titled The Sacred Band, 300 Lovers Fighting to Save Greek Freedom, which is a thrilling deep dive into the last decades of ancient Greek freedom leading up to Alexander the Great's destruction of Thebes. So, what originally got you interested in studying ancient Greek and Roman history?
It's been a passion of mine for about 20 years, ever since I discovered the story of Alexander the Great. He's the most amazing story that one can find anywhere, ancient, modern, medieval. And once I got hooked on that, I started exploring what came before and after. So I'm sort of spreading out from that center.
And you've gone on to receive several academic awards and acknowledgements. So you want to talk about some of those acknowledgements and awards you've received from your passion for Greek and Roman history?
Well, most recently, I received a fellowship from the National Endowment of Humanities, the so-called Public Scholars Program, designed to make scholarly work or research available to a wide audience, to make it popular. And that's how this book came to be. It's an effort to make a period of history that is mostly known to scholars accessible to a wide audience.
Right, yeah. So continuing that, what else made you interested in the story of specifically these 300 Theban warriors and ultimately the publication of this book? And maybe what kind of feedback are you expecting from the publication of your book?
Well, it's already gotten some attention from the New Yorker. Some of your listeners may have seen in the April 19th issue the amazing illustration that was created for the book of the mass grave of the Sacred Band of Thebes as it was uncovered in the 19th century. So the Sacred Band was a corps of 300 infantrymen fighting in phalanx formation, and they were buried in phalanx formation as a unit, and their grave was uncovered in 1880. And my digital illustrator was able to reassemble all the drawings that were made at that time and give you an image of the grave as it looked, with the entire Sacred Band in phalanx formation. So it's a quite remarkable story. The 300 members of the unit were recruited from pairs of male lovers because the Thebans felt that the best way to motivate men in battle was if they were defending their beloved and trying to shine in their beloved's eyes. So this proved to be the most powerful motivator that the Greeks ever found. And the Sacred Band were the most victorious regiment that the Greeks ever fielded.
For sure. So what was the original, what was the state of the archaeological site when they ended up finding it?
So the grave was underneath a monument called the Lion of Chaeronea, at the site of Chaeronea in northern Greece. The lion was an enormous marble monument of a crouching lion, and that was also discovered in the 19th century in fragments that has since been reconstructed. It's an amazing image. The lion is sitting looking off into the distance and clearly in a somber kind of defeated posture. This was the monument that was erected over the grave of the Sacred Band because they were buried where they were defeated by Alexander the Great.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And I'm actually studying archaeology as an undergrad. So specifically, the archaeological context was really fascinating to me. Like you said, they were buried in a phalanx formation. They're all lined up in a row. Like you were saying, how they were found it's an amazing find for sure. And then the history behind it as well in your book.
Yes, and the drawings of the skeletons showing their fractures, their hack marks where they were wounded, often blades that were embedded in their bones. tell the story of their last hours, how they were destroyed on the battlefield by Alexander in 338 BC.
Yeah, so I can give a little intro and background for your book because, like I said, I finished reading it the other day and I found it absolutely amazing. So you guys should definitely go and read it once it's published. When is the published date for it?
June 8th.
June 8th. So it's coming up pretty soon. So
Indeed.
make sure you guys hop on it. It's a wonderful book for sure. And you know what I liked about it specifically was it's not written in a hard language. It's pretty easy to understand, and you write it almost in a literary form where it takes you back in time to the story and the places where all these warriors were.
Well, that's what I was striving for. The stories are so marvelous that it's a shame if people feel like they have no access because names are unfamiliar, places are unfamiliar, the mechanics of infantry warfare are unfamiliar. There's a lot of sort of background information that some people feel intimidated by, but I've tried to make all that feel very natural and accessible.
Yeah, and I think you did an amazing job with that because, like I said, it's very easy to understand. And you start the book, and by the time you're done, you just went on this amazing journey throughout Greek history, and you're like, "What happened?" I just started reading this book. It felt like, and yeah, it's written in such a great form. It's very easy to understand, and it provides a very important story for ancient Greece, and specifically the story of Thebes.
Well, I'm glad you found it that way. That's what I was striving for.
But yeah, I can give a little intro for the people that don't know about your book. So what happened was in 1880, a mass grave containing the remains of 254 soldiers was discovered in Greece near Thebes. Linked arm in arm, this sacred band of warriors, an elite 300-man corps, formed in 378 BC, went undefeated in combat for 40 years, recruited from pairs of male lovers, buried together on the battlefield, where they fell after facing a teenage Alexander the Great in his first major battle. So provide an overview of the story, even though I kind of did a little bit there, but from your perspective.
Yeah, so there's the background to the creation of the sacred band is the conflict between Sparta and Thebes in the 4th century BC. Sparta was at that time the superpower of the Greek world and in many eyes the bully of the Greek world. They were throwing their weight around and actually occupied the center of Thebes, the fortress called the Cadmea, which allowed them to dictate Theban policy and put a puppet government in place. So Thebes became practically an occupied city in 382 for 3 years' time. Then, miraculously, the Thebans were able to throw off that occupation and liberate themselves. It's the story that opens my narrative. 12 covert operatives were snuck into the city and dressed as women. And they were admitted to a party at which the members of the ruling junta were present, and they assassinated the leadership of the Spartan puppet government and then managed to retake the rest of the city. So having angered Sparta, which is something that you never want to do in the Greek world, they knew that retribution would be coming, and they built the sacred band as a way to fend off the counterstroke that Sparta was preparing.
Right, and I want to go back for a second to you mentioned the article that they wrote in the New Yorker, and it was saying, springs from my sense that these little-told stories are the ones that most need to be told, especially when, in the Theban case, the protagonists had no historians of their own. So, furthermore, explain your position on the importance of the publication of your book and why people should choose to read this story and the importance of ultimately this band of Theban lovers.
Well, we tend to focus on Sparta and Athens when we talk about the Greek world. Sparta, familiar to many of us from the movie 300 and the sequel. Athens, because that was the center of Greek intellectual life, and the Parthenon. But nobody talks about Thebes. Thebes became almost eclipsed by those other two cities, even though it was for a long time the superpower and able to match both of those cities on the battlefield. So why is this? Why did Thebes fall off the map? It has to do with the prejudices of the Greek historian of this time, Xenophon. The only history that survives of the 4th century BC is written by Xenophon, and he detested the Thebans. He was a great Spartophile. He thought Sparta was the natural leader of Greece and deserved to be top dog. And when the Thebans then took him down, he did his best to cover up any of the achievements of the Thebans, especially on the battlefield, and to cover up the existence of the sacred band. He left them out of his history entirely. So we're all victims of the biases of a man writing in the 4th century BC, because the information that we could have had has been erased.
Right, and just like you were saying, I'm very familiar with the history of Athens and the idea of Athens versus Sparta. Mm-hmm. But then the story of Thebes, like you were saying, it's almost very suppressed. And like you're saying, it's not mentioned in Xenophon's histories. And ultimately, when you wrote this book and I ended up reading it, I was amazed that there was another city, essentially, at the same time that rivaled both of these powers and was just as great, if not greater than the cities like Athens and Sparta. Thebes was famous in Greek legend and literature, obviously. Known for the birthplace of the Greek hero Hercules. A lot of this stuff is mentioned in your book. Mm-hmm. Played a major role in the story of Dionysus, mm-hmm. and also perhaps most famous Greek poet, Pindar, lived in Thebes. So mm-hmm. How do you think these lovers contributed to the story of Greece and Thebes in particular?
So Thebes had a uniquely tolerant, even a welcoming attitude towards gay male relationships. And men seem to have stayed together for life at Thebes, unlike in other places. The word that's used of them is a word that's commonly applied to marriage. So they had a kind of gay marriage in Thebes, unlike other Greek cities. So that seems to be the reason why this band was so successful, because it was created out of men who were devoted to one another and pledged as partners for life.
Right. And your tale, it begins in 379 BC with this group of Theban patriots stealing into Spartan-occupied Thebes. And you were talking about this at the beginning, but they were disguised in women's clothing. They cut down the agents of Sparta in defense of Greek democracy. And then this is ultimately what became the sacred band, these 300 lovers. So let's talk a little bit more about the early years of these warriors.
Mm-hmm. So Sparta, of course, invaded after the reconquest of Thebes, and they tried to take the city back. They invaded 3 times in 3 successive years, but failed each time. And in their last attempt, they met up with the sacred band at a moment when both sides were not expecting an encounter. There was a kind of surprise encounter that neither was prepared for. And ordinarily, if you encounter a Spartan army in the field, you turn and run. Very few Greek armies, especially if you're outnumbered, would face the Spartans in battle. But the sacred band managed to hold its ground, pull itself together, and defeat a larger Spartan force. So that was the first time any Spartan army that outnumbered its opponent had ever been defeated. It rocked the Greek world to the core.
Right, and once you think of Greek history, the military might is really in the form of Sparta. So the fact that this group of warriors from Thebes were able to take on one of the greatest armies of the time, because the Spartans were ruthless, and we see this throughout history. They really had the true military might. That's what they were known for. Athens was known for its democracy, and Sparta for its military might. So the fact that these Theban warriors were able to take on one of the greatest military powers of the time is an amazing story that's described beautifully in your book with this sacred band. But the sacred band, obviously, it was a troop of select soldiers, consisted of this 150 pair of male lovers, so 300 overall, 150 pairs. And that's ultimately what formed the elite force for the Theban army in the 4th century. And it's amazing because they were able to go on and ultimately try to end the Spartan domination of the time.
That's right. They counter-invaded and entered the Peloponnese, which formerly had been practically a Spartan protectorate. Nobody messed with the Peloponnese because that was all Spartan territory. But the Thebans penetrated, actually got to the very doorsteps of Sparta, but didn't take the city, but destroyed Spartan military power by robbing it of the military slaves, the state-owned slaves on which the military machine was built, the helots. The Thebans built a city, a fortress city for the helots so that they could be free of Spartan domination. And the Spartans would have to grow their own food and raise their own crops, which they'd never had to do before. So that was largely responsible for the decline of Spartan power starting in 379.
Yeah, so do you want to talk about the development of that city?
So we're talking about the city of Messene, which is in the western part of the Peloponnese. It's on the tourist trail. You can visit it, and it's remarkably well preserved. It's built of beautiful, perfectly carved blocks of stone with walls 14 feet thick, many of them still intact, many parts of it, of the wall still intact, built by the Thebans in 85 days in 370 BC as a protection for these escaped slaves, so that Sparta would never be able to reconquer them. Sparta tried for decades to get Messene back, to get its helots back, but never succeeded.
So this city was built to help protect against the Spartan domination, essentially.
Well, to undermine the economic basis of their military might. The helots, state-owned slaves, were employed growing the food crops so that the Spartans never needed to farm. They could spend their entire adult lives in military service. So without the helots, the whole thing didn't work. It was quite a genius move on the part of the Thebans to pull the rug out from under the Spartan military machine.
Yeah, right. And if you have a structure that's built in such a way as that, and you take out the source of their food, something that they so necessarily depend on, especially to feed these large armies that are moving across mainland Greece all the time to take on different military powers. Like you're saying, it's genius to be able to aim at something like that in order to try to take down this seemingly invincible Spartan force of the time.
Exactly.
So let's talk about the Sacred Band and their crucial role in the Battle of Leuctra.
Of Leuctra.
How do I say that? Leuctra in 371 BC.
Yes. So after the battle that I told you about, where the Thebans showed they could hold their own against the Spartans, they invited a much larger confrontation by defying Spartan will at a time when they knew that it would provoke an invasion. And the Spartans invaded. They brought 20,000 men, themselves and their allies, to the plain of Leuctra, which is about 10 miles south of Thebes. And the Thebans went there to meet them. And in the course of the battle, the sacred band was used as a kind of projectile hurled right at the strongest point of the Spartan line, where the Spartan king was stationed, and they fatally wounded the king on contact and killed several other top officers and broke the Spartan line. Spartans had never been broken in an open field battle in their entire history, hundreds of years. And the Thebans succeeded in doing that at Leuctra. And again, the effects were devastating. The Greeks never again feared the Spartan warriors as they had before that. The myth of Spartan invincibility had been broken.
Right. Yeah. So let's elaborate more on that. The Spartan morale after such a huge defeat, because obviously, like you're saying, they weren't used to such a defeat like that. That was one of the first that they've experienced.
Yes, it was devastating. They had always relied on their reputation for invincibility. Most of the time, they didn't need to fight their enemies because their enemies would turn and run. They were simply feared. They were feared as we would fear nuclear weapons. But now that they had been defeated, that fear was dissipated, and it was never restored. They never again recovered their position.
Right. And we talked a little bit about the Spartan morale and the camaraderie that they had, and ultimately how terrible that defeat was. But let's talk about the other side, and let's talk about the importance of a huge subject that takes up your book, the idea of Greek eros, and how it developed camaraderie for the Thebans, and how it ultimately made them into a pretty formidable fighting force.
Yes. So many people are familiar with Greek love, as we sometimes call it, a model of male relations in which an older partner courts a younger male. It's often referred to as pederasty, although I don't particularly like that term. But it flourished in military settings for obvious reasons. And the Spartans, as we know, actually encouraged male erotic relationships in the military. And then the Thebans used it as the principle on which they built the sacred band.
So were the Spartans and the Athenians familiar with this same idea of Greek eros?
Yes, very much so. Many of your listeners probably have read Plato's Symposium. It's commonly read in schools. The love that's talked about in the Symposium is between two men. It's exclusively a homosexual text. So Athens was a place where these relations flourished, and Sparta, but only at Thebes, as I mentioned before, do the relationships seem to have had this permanence. When Plato talks about them in the Symposium, he assumes that most of them are transitory and that they dissipate after the younger partner, becomes an adult. But at Thebes, that wasn't the case. They seem to have been lifelong relationships. So that is what made Thebes the place where a sacred band could be formed.
Okay. And you talked about Plato's Symposium, but you also talk about Socrates and his ideas of Greek eros in your book as well.
Well, Socrates is the principal speaker of Plato's Symposium. So we don't know exactly what Socrates' own views are. We know what Plato put in his mouth and what Xenophon also put in his mouth. And what's interesting is that Plato and Xenophon differ very strongly in the way that they portray Socrates, and especially his views about male eros. In Plato, male eros is perfectly accepted. Socrates has some idealistic notions that if you don't actually have physical contact, you may be able to reach a higher spiritual plane through your passion for your beloved. Xenophon says that physical contact is taboo, and it's outlawed by the Spartans as strongly as incest. So he very much demonizes male homosexuality in a way that Plato's Socrates never does.
Right. So compared to the idea of gay marriage and gay rights and gay beliefs today, how does that differ from the views of it in the ancient times, or are they similar?
Well, I think Thebes is a good parallel to modern ideas of gay marriage. It was really the original gay marriage in the Western world.
Right. And when you talk about that in your book, I find it interesting because I feel like there's such a suppression of it today, but almost back in Greek history and during Greek times, this was a fairly common thing. And like you're saying, it was used to build camaraderie among soldiers. The idea that you're going to war with your beloved, that you'll die there on the battlefield, it helped build morale ultimately.
Exactly so.
So another important topic in your book is ultimately the people who write the history, and oftentimes this is the victors. So how does the story of Thebes defy the axiom that history is written by the victors?
Well, Thebes didn't have a literate tradition the way that Athens did. It did have the poet Pindar, who you mentioned, but it didn't have a strong tradition of letters. In fact, the Thebans were thought to be kind of slow-witted in the eyes of other Greeks. They didn't have the wittiness and the command of language, the eloquence that Athenians had. So they didn't produce any writers of note other than Pindar, and no one to tell their own story. They had to be chronicled by others, including Xenophon, who hated them. And so therefore we have the only history that survives is one which is very detrimental to Thebes.
Right, and that's pretty sad because you get only a one-side story of Thebes. It's a very negative outlook. So how did you go about discovering the other side of that, archaeologically, research-wise, and how do you use that to help build your book and a more positive view of Thebes?
Well, luckily we have one Theban-friendly source from the ancient world, but he's from much later in time than the events that he writes about. We have Plutarch, and many of your listeners know of Plutarch's parallel lives, pairing a life of a Greek hero with a Roman hero to show the similarities. And fortunately, Plutarch, who was himself from the region around Thebes, recorded the life of one Theban hero, Pelopidas, in great detail. And Pelopidas was one of the leaders of that plot I mentioned, the 12 covert operatives who took Thebes back from the Spartans. And then he went on to command the sacred band in battle. So he was an integral part of the rise of Thebes in this period. Plutarch's biography of Pelopidas was a major source for me. Plutarch also wrote a biography of the other great Theban of this time, Epaminondas. And that life is one which would tell us a lot more about Thebes, but unfortunately was lost from the parallel lives at an early stage in its transmission. And so we no longer have it to refer to.
And if I remember correctly, your book, it takes place in the 300s BC.
That's right.
Is that correct? And Plutarch was, I believe, 45 to 50-ish CE. I think he was born around that time. So how are you able to use Plutarch, who's kind of far away in time from the actual events of the sacred band, as a reliable source? Were you able to check that with the archaeological record?
Well, the only archaeological record we really have is the mass grave, and that only tells us about the Battle of Chaeronea. Yes, using Plutarch is very tricky because he's so late, so far beyond the time of the events that he's writing about. But He did original research. He was reading primary sources from the time and taking his information from authors who have since become lost, but were still available in Plutarch's day. So it's secondhand information, but it's still very valuable information. And as long as one treats it with care, doesn't believe everything one reads, it can be used to reconstruct the events of the 4th century BC.
So it's safe to say that you think Plutarch was fairly unbiased in his writings about the sacred band, and that you were able to use that as a reliable source to research these Theban lovers.
I think he is reliable. Yes, there are some who would dispute that. There's skeptics who don't believe what Plutarch has to say about the band, but I think it's reliable.
So why does the story of the sacred band, who was previously suppressed by the Greek historian Xenophon, who we were talking about earlier, of the 19th century, and many scholars of the 1800s as well, express the importance of male eros or love throughout Greek history? So talk more about the conflicting views of Xenophon and Plutarch.
Yes, so Xenophon, as I said, was a Spartophile. He thought the Spartans were the models of virtue and morality, and it was on them that the future of Greece rested. He wanted them to be top dog, and he actually fought under a Spartan general, even though he was Athenian himself. And the Spartans gave him an estate on which he lived a large part of his life in gratitude for his service to Sparta. So he was very close to the Spartan leadership, and his sons were educated at Sparta. He was practically an honorary citizen. So when Thebes proved to be victorious over Sparta, that galled him, and he did his best to turn the tables by writing history in a very pro-Spartan vein, effacing some of the great Theban accomplishments. He doesn't even mention the founding of Messene, this city that was built to house the Helots that were escaped from Sparta, a huge event for its time. And Xenophon pretends that it never happened.
Oh, wow. And you were describing how Xenophon was a pretty reputable person. So do you think he was able to get away with the way he described the Thebans because of the people he was surrounded by? Like the fact that he was surrounded by mainly Spartans opposed to a Theban people? And how do you think he was able to get away with writing the Theban story in such a negative light?
Yes, I think he was counting on the prejudices of his audience. The Athenians weren't too crazy about Thebes either. He knew that he would have a receptive readership if he downplayed Theban greatness. So, yes, he was playing to the crowd. Thebes was very unpopular because it became too powerful. The Athenians didn't like having a rival right on their borders. And, of course, the Spartans didn't like being defeated.
Right. And I think of the idea of Greek history very much in the light of Renaissance history, the idea that Europe was essentially united in very few occurrences against forces like the Mongols and the Muslims in the Middle East. However, individually, and when they weren't going to war against forces like the Mongols, they were very much their own city-states, very much their own kingdoms, just like the Greeks. Thebes, Sparta, and Athens were all very much their own town. So how do you think they were able to get that? This is a little bit off topic, but how do you think they were all able to unite with all these differences later on to fight such opposing forces?
Well, they were finally united by Philip and Alexander, by the Macedonians. The cities of Greece continued to battle one another and weaken one another all through the 4th century until finally Philip and Alexander practically invaded or inserted themselves into central Greece and forced the Greeks into a coalition, which is something like the modern nation state of Greece. So it took an outside force. It took a Macedonian superpower to overcome all the differences that had kept them apart.
I'm trying to think of questions here. You've covered a lot of stuff in quite a little bit of time. Usually I have people that talk quite a bit longer, but I like that we were able to have this back and forth. This is good. So, but I can go back a little bit. Your book helps explain much of LGBTQ history, like we were talking about, and especially in antiquity, obviously with the sacred band and the history of Greece, specifically Thebes. But what steps do you think need to be made to kind of rectify these grave omissions that we've been talking about?
Well, I hope that my book is a first step. And there have been other books about Thebes, and there's certainly a lot more interest now than there ever was in male eros in the Greek world and homosexuality. Those were verboten topics. Those were forbidden topics for a long time. And in the 19th century, at least the early 19th century, the Western world didn't even acknowledge that such things existed. There was no public discussion of gay love. And when it was discussed, it was demonized. The Greek texts from my period, Plato's Symposium, the stories of the sacred band, the candid discussions of male sexuality and homosexuality, those had an enormous liberating effect on the 19th century. It showed, especially to gay men in England, that there was such a thing as heroic male love. There was a society that valued and even heroized men like themselves. So several sections of my book deal with the discovery in the 19th century of the story of the sacred band and of Greek love and the effect that had on people like Oscar Wilde, Walt Whitman, John Addington Symonds, some of the leading writers and intellectuals of the day, to know that Greek love did exist and was valued was hugely affirmative for them when there were no other models of positive models of male homosexuality.
So why do you think there's such a taking to this idea of Greek eras, specifically today? Because you brought that up.
Well, I think that today's society, in our country, in America, where gay marriage is now legal, gays in the military are accepted, many parts of the world have followed suit. This is a time that is closest to the Greek world than any other time in history. There has never been as wide an acceptance as there is today of male homosexual relations, except in classical Greece.
So what separates Thebes from other Greek states in their belief of male couples and lifelong union? And talk about this early form of gay marriage, or continue, because we've been talking about it, but also supporting the inclusion of gays in the military back then and today.
So what took the 19th century by surprise was the idea that gay men could be as brave and powerful as straight men, or even more so. That is to say, homosexuality was not feminizing or was not debilitating. It didn't cause weakness. It, in fact, could be seen as a form of strength. So I think that's what's so revolutionary about this story, the story of the Sacred Band, is that it proved that there was nothing weak or feminine necessarily about attraction of men to other men.
So how does Thebes compare to Athens and Sparta in their view of Greek eros? Was there different views of it depending on the city-state, or were they all pretty much similar?
Very different views. Plato makes that clear in Symposium. He talks about the different forms of the different models of male relations in Athens, Sparta, and Thebes. And Thebes, as I say, was uniquely monogamous, and the relationships had a unique longevity. So perhaps we could talk more about the rise of the Macedonians, why it was possible for Philip and Alexander to take over as they did in the 340s and 330s, and what it meant for them to destroy the Sacred Band, because I think that's an important part of the story. The destruction of the Sacred Band at the Battle of Chaeronea by Alexander the Great, who was then only 18 years old and fighting in his first battle, is one of the endpoints of my story, because it really destroyed any hope that the Greeks had of preserving their autonomy. The Sacred Band was their last best hope to defeat this superpower from the north that was clearly bent on crushing them, or at least forcing them to toe their line. And for the Greeks, that was a kind of slavery, to have to submit to some larger power and truckle to their dictate. So the destruction of the Sacred Band was like a demonstration to the Greek world that their time was over, that it was now Macedon that was going to call the shots. So I think that's important. So that's what makes the image of the grave, which, as I mentioned, is in the April 19th New Yorker, so moving. It was a symbol of Greek resistance, and for Macedon, it was a symbol of the finality of their victory.
Right, and I think it was also kind of the finality of this idea of democracy, what they were fighting for, because after this point in time, Alexander the Great takes over, and it's very much a dictatorship, a military force that's hell-bent on conquering much of the Middle East and even farther, as we've seen him do in history.
Yes, I don't know if I'd use the word dictatorship, but it was certainly a tight-fisted hegemony. It was an exercise of power that the Greeks clearly had no right to differ from Macedon, to set their own policy. They had to go along with whatever Philip and Alexander wanted, including the invasion of Asia and the conquest of the Middle East.
Right, and we talked about it earlier. Before this point in time, all of these city-states were very distinct. They very much had their own culture, and because of Philip and Alexander the Great, like you were saying, they ultimately were all kind of forced almost to become a part of this Macedonian empire.
Indeed. Philip formed what he called the League of Corinth, or rather he called it the League, and it met at Corinth, so we call it the League of Corinth, in which each city sent representatives, and common decisions were taken, and policies were enacted, much like the United Nations. But of course, Philip was always in charge, and so the policies that were passed had to be ones that he approved of.
Right. So would you describe this as almost an oligarchy then?
Well, I would call it a hegemony, a very brutal hegemony that was enforced by military force.
So Philip was ultimately at the head, Alexander the Great was at the head, and they had a little bit of say, but not nearly as much as they did with the Greek democracy that had existed before that point in time.
Exactly.
Right, and I think that's a good spot for the ending of your book, because that's ultimately what the Sacred Band represented, right? Was this idea of democracy and fighting for your loved ones and fighting for this idea of Greek freedom. And
yes, and it's not quite the end point, because there's one epilogue after 3 years after the destruction of the band. Thebes mounted a rebellion against Alexander, declared themselves independent, and taunted him as a tyrant of Greece, and urged other Greek states to come to their side and stand up against the tyrant. Alexander brought his army to the gates of Thebes, and in a fierce battle, he forced his way inside the city and slaughtered thousands of Thebans, and eventually destroyed the entire city, leveled it to the ground. Something like our use of nuclear weapons on Japan in the Second World War. It was a demonstration that there would be no contradiction or no challenge to Macedonian power.
right, and I think that's a good intro into some wrap-up questions, because I want to talk about the importance of this story of the Sacred Band today and what we can learn from it today going forward, to not repeat some of those same mistakes that were repeated back then.
Yeah, well, it's hard to draw clear lessons or to say what the mistakes were, except that, of course, the Greeks' failure to get along with each other and to set common policies debilitated the entire civilization.
Right, that's more what I was saying before.
Yes, the fractiousness, the constant skirmishing between city-states weakened everyone, caused huge economic damage, and created a whole class of mercenary soldiers, men who were only fighting for pay, who didn't have allegiance to any particular state, but fought for whoever paid them the highest. And that was similar in some ways to the proliferation of heavy weapons today and of assault rifles and military-style rifles, that you could form an army simply by having a lot of money. You didn't need to have a cause or a national identity. You simply needed money, and people would flock to your side and fight for you. So that's a very volatile situation. It allows upstarts and warlords to take power and destabilizes the whole political system. So I would compare that with where we are today in the arms market. We see what's happening now in Israel and Gaza, where a nation state like Gaza can accumulate heavy weapons simply with enough money.
Right, and after I finished reading your book, that's what I found interesting as well. Was I did see a lot of those comparisons to today, the importance of gay rights and the expression of male love as people are fighting for today. The idea of all of these different military states and all the conflicts that we're experiencing, the fight for democracy and some foreign countries, third world countries specifically. So I think not only is your book a great representation of Greek history, but can also be an important lesson in the stuff that we're going through today. And that's why I wanted to bring up that question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that the parallels are there. We have to be careful whenever we draw parallels, because our times are so much different than Greek times. Warfare between advanced countries is no longer a daily occurrence. We haven't seen superpower wars or wars between European and Western countries in a long time, and hopefully never will. But for the Greeks, it was almost a permanent condition of life. that you went to war with your neighbors on a regular basis.
Yeah, and another wrap-up question. I wanted to talk more about the impact of the sacred demand. The sacred band on the visible discussions of male arrows in the 19th century, like you're talking about with Walt Whitman and Oscar Wilde, and then some of those same conversations that are occurring today. How do you think the sacred band ultimately impacted some of those discussions?
Well, I think I addressed that, this was the first time that there was a public acknowledgement that gay male love was a thing. No one had ever talked about it until the 1820s, when scholars of Greek antiquity began to discuss texts like Plato's Symposium or Plutarch's account of the sacred band. These were the first accessible written accounts in which gay love was a thing, was acknowledged. So, we have to think back to a time when the word homosexual didn't exist. There was no concept that there was any other kind of passion, any other kind of erotic love except between a man and a woman. And these texts had a revelatory impact.
Right. And like you were saying, we did talk about it before, but I think that's a very important part of your book and why people are going to find it very interesting, not only for the story alone, but also for this idea of the Greek eros. And like you were saying, it's on a rise today with a lot of the stuff we're experiencing. A lot of people have a passion to look into that kind of stuff and that history. So I think your book is coming out at a perfect time to conquer some of those questions and to describe a very important time in history where these ideas were expressed.
I hope you're right.
So I guess I have just one final question for you, and that is, what kind of feedback are you expecting from this book? What kind of what do you expect in response? What do you hope people get out of this book?
Well, above all, I hope they enjoy the story. I've tried to tell the story in a way that builds suspense, that takes you by surprise with its twists and turns, and bring out some of the more colorful characters. We haven't talked at all about the women that I've tried to explore. The character of Phryne, who was a famous courtesan, basically a girlfriend for hire, and built up a huge fortune, became very well known, was the first sort of super celebrity based on sex appeal. And her image is preserved in some artworks from the ancient world that went on to influence the Renaissance. So hugely
Right, the Venus of Botticelli.
Yes, she's the inspiration for Botticelli's Venus Rising from the Sea. So I've interspersed stories throughout the book of these very colorful, intriguing figures that most of your listeners probably will never have heard of, but hopefully they will remember them.
Right. Well, that's why your book's important, to bring out these little known stories, like you were commenting in the New Yorker. The idea that not everybody has the access or the ability, oftentimes the victors write the story. So to bring to light these stories that people may not know is such an important thing. And as I've said, you've done that very well with the Sacred Band in your book. So as far as your book, where can people get it once it's published? And do you have a website? Do you have anything you want to plug towards the end of the show here?
I do have a website. It's jamesromm.com. ROMM is the spelling of the last name. I think the book is probably available through all the usual sources, internet and bookstores, Barnes and Noble. And if your listeners are interested, on June 8th, the publication day, there will be an online discussion hosted by my local bookstore, Oblong Books, and that's something that they can register for free and hear a conversation between myself and Daniel Mendelsohn, who's another scholar of classical antiquity and a very admired writer, talking about the events in the book.
Awesome. And I want to bring up a viewer appreciation here. Sharing one of our viewers. Thanks to you, James, for being able to do this. A lot of great questions and conversations discussed. Always happy to learn about our past, and hope your book does well going forward. And I hope your book does well as well.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, James, for joining us today. And it was a good episode. So
it's my pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for watching. And we'll see you in the next one.